The night Tamar, once described as hazy, chaotic, and emotionally overwhelming, has now become the sharpest point of public focus. Because the recent revelations offered by Funky Dineva, and later intensified by Tasha K, have completely reshaped how that night is understood. What was initially perceived as an innocent blur of events, framed by Tamar as a sequence clouded by fear, trauma, and confusion, now appears more structured and intentional once all the missing elements begin aligning. The public had originally accepted Tamar's portrayal of the night because her emotional delivery seemed sincere, her pauses felt vulnerable, and her fragmented recollections presented her as someone struggling to make sense of an overwhelming experience. But the moment Funky introduced a detailed, spatial account describing exact movements in the Uber, the shifting dynamics in the group, and the unmistakable closeness between Tamar and Mendeecees, the audience realized there was a foundational layer Tamar never acknowledged. That foundational layer becomes even more critical once Tasha K adds the final catalyst, the DNA test. Tamar once referenced quietly but never contextualized. Suddenly, the narrative that Tamar framed as confusion begins to look less like a foggy memory and more like an edited version of events, designed to exclude specifics that could reshape the entire story. With each new detail emerging, her timeline appears less like a trauma-induced blur and more like a curated set of emotional beats that conveniently avoid the portions of the night most likely to raise questions. This shift in understanding doesn't come from scandalous accusations, but from the alignment between Funky's consistent recollection and the implications behind the DNA test Tamar subtly introduced, but never fully explained. As these pieces come together, what the audience once accepted as an accidental fog now feels like deliberate omission. And what Tamar positioned as emotional vulnerability begins to resemble narrative control. The contrast between her soft delivery and the clarity of others' testimonies forces the public to reconsider everything they thought they knew. It becomes increasingly clear that the confusing night might not have been confusing at all, may simply have been presented that way to avoid naming the connection at the center of the timeline. And now, with the new information circulating widely, the public perception shifts instantly. Tamar's blurred story sharpens, the hidden dynamics gain visibility, and the night that once looked innocent no longer looks confusing in the slightest. Funky Dineva's account of the night stands in stark contrast to Tamar's emotionally charged narrative because his version is rooted not in feelings, but in spatial awareness, environmental detail, and the instinctive discomfort that comes only from witnessing a dynamic he was never meant to see. Instead of framing the night as chaotic or confusing, Funky describes it with the clarity of someone who remembers exactly what made him uneasy: the shifting energy inside the Uber, Tamar's steady physical closeness to Mendeecees, and the subtle but undeniable change in atmosphere. That made him feel like an unwanted observer in a moment that carried an intimacy he could not ignore. His confession is exhausted not because he seeks drama, but because he has carried the burden of public speculation for years, while being blamed for events he neither caused nor understood. As he recounts the night, he provides a grounded timeline: the restaurant, the movement to the car, the arrangement of seats, the moments where body language replaced words, and the precise second the energy tightened into something that excluded him entirely. His exhaustion becomes clearer as he explains how the closeness between Tamar and Mendeecees was not theoretical or emotional, but literal, physical, and unfolding inches away from him. He remembers how Tamar leaned in, how their interactions shifted from casual group energy to something more centered, and how the silence in the car was not confusion but concentration to people locked into their own dynamic. His description of discomfort goes beyond irritation. It is the discomfort of someone who instinctively senses that the energy has become private, intimate, and not meant for outside eyes. This is why his decision to step away later in the night carries so much weight. He did not storm off or confront anyone. He simply recognized that the night no longer belonged to him and quietly removed himself from a situation that felt increasingly personal between Tamar and Mendeecees. His confession, free from theatrics and grounded in lived detail, ultimately forces the audience to reevaluate the entire timeline. It becomes clear that Funky was not part of the emotional narrative. Tamar later shaped he was part of the physical reality she left out, and the weariness in his voice reflects the pain of carrying a truth that contradicts the version the world chose to believe for so long. Tamar's emotional interview presented itself as a heartfelt, vulnerable moment. Yet underneath the tears and trembling voice lay several conspicuous gaps, omissions and selective memories that raise more questions than answers. While she leaned heavily on emotional framing, speaking about how overwhelmed, blindsided, and deeply hurt she felt, she simultaneously skirted around critical details that would have provided clarity, especially for an audience already buzzing with conflicting narratives. Notably, Tamar never outlined the precise timeline of events leading up to the confrontation that triggered all this discourse. Instead, she leaned into broad language like "when everything happened" or "after I found out," without describing what she found out or who told her. This ambiguity creates space for speculation while allowing her to remain unpinned to any factual sequence. Additionally, her mention of previous tensions was vague and selective. She referenced ongoing issues, yet omitted specifics about what those issues were, how long they had existed, and whether they contributed to the escalation. She also avoided naming individuals directly responsible for fueling her emotional spiral, despite the fact that blogs, insiders, and commentary channels have already positioned certain players as pivotal characters. The silence on those names appears intentional, possibly to maintain plausible deniability while still implying she was wronged. Furthermore, Tamar did not address contradictions that emerged from earlier statements she made on social platforms, where her tone and claims differed from the more defensive, measured stance she adopted in the interview. Her avoidance of clear accountability was evident. She apologized for the confusion, not for any specific action, and used passive language like things were said, rather than acknowledging her own contributions to the tension, even when discussing her emotional reactions. Tamar framed them as responses to external chaos rather than outcomes influenced by her own decisions. Perhaps most notably, she skipped over the moments everyone expected her to clarify. What exactly triggered the sudden shift in her relationship dynamics? What she knew about the alleged conversations happening behind the scenes, and why her narrative conflicts with those of other individuals involved. These strategic omissions, blended with selective vulnerability, allowed Tamar to control the emotional tone without committing to concrete facts. The result is an interview that feels powerful yet incomplete, a story told with intention, framed to gain sympathy, but deliberately crafted to keep the most incriminating or controversial details out of public reach. When Tasha K enters the narrative, the entire situation shifts from emotional testimony and fragmented accounts to something far more strategic, structured, and high stakes. Her tone, calm, measured, and almost surgically calculated, immediately reframes the conversation. Because unlike the emotionally charged statements circulating from other parties, Tasha approaches the situation with a posture of certainty and documentation. The most significant pivot occurs when she brings up the one element that everyone else has danced around but never addressed directly: the alleged DNA test. By referencing it plainly without theatrics or hesitation, she cuts through the noise surrounding the interviews, reactions, and online speculation. Her mention of the DNA test is not casual. It is presented as a critical missing link, implying that there is verifiable information that some parties are actively avoiding or withholding. This instantly elevates the stakes, because a DNA test introduces factuality, accountability, and paternity implications, elements that cannot be explained away with emotional narratives or selective memory. Moreover, Tasha's delivery suggests she has receipts, or at least access to individuals who do. And that confidence destabilizes the previously dominant storylines. Driven by Tamar's emotional framing or Funky Dineva's lived experience, her reveal forces the audience to reconsider who is telling the full truth, and who is strategically curating their version of events. It also puts pressure on Tamar specifically because her entire interview avoided any mention of this test, even though it appears central to the underlying tension. Tasha's entrance creates a contrast. Where Tamar left gaps, Tasha fills them with hard questioning. Where Funky tried to remove himself from the chaos, Tasha leans directly into the most controversial parts. Additionally, Tasha's disclosure reframes the public's understanding of motivations. Suddenly, Tamar's tears may look like diversion. Funky's discomfort may seem more justified. And the behind-the-scenes whispers start sounding less like baseless gossip and more like strategically suppressed truths. The calmness with which Tasha presents her information is particularly impactfully to communicate that she is not rattled, not defensive, and not speculating. She is presenting what she perceives as facts. That demeanor signals credibility to many viewers, especially those who felt something was missing from the earlier accounts. Ultimately, Tasha K's reveal does not simply add new information. It reshapes the narrative hierarchy, placing her version of events at the center of public scrutiny and forcing everyone else's statements to be reevaluated under a sharper, more forensic lens. The moment the alleged DNA test enters the conversation, the entire timeline shifts from scattered emotional recollections to a structured sequence that can be traced, questioned, and cross-referenced. Suddenly, the night that Tamar described with emotional fog and fragmented details is no longer evaluated solely on feelings, tone, or memory lapses. It becomes anchored to an objective point that demands clarity. The alleged test acts as a bridge between Tamar's ambiguity and Funky Dineva's precise, grounded observations. Funky's account, which focused on spatial awareness, energy shifts, and the discomfort he felt, was previously understood as just one perspective. But when the DNA test becomes part of the storyline, his narrative gains new weight because it aligns with the possibility that something deeper, more consequential, and more concealed was occurring that night. Meanwhile, Tamar's emotional delivery, her tears, pauses, and avoidance of specific details begins to appear less like confusion and more like a strategic withholding, especially since she never acknowledged the test despite its relevance to the conflict unfolding around her. The timeline can no longer be seen as a series of personal misunderstandings. It transforms into a chain of events influenced by motivations tied to the implications of that test. The test, therefore, becomes the central gravitational force pulling all narratives into alignment. It explains why Tamar might have framed her story protectively, why Funky may have felt an unspoken tension, and why social media kept circulating theories that seemed disproportionate until now. It also reframes Tasha K's involvement not as someone stirring drama, but as someone bringing forward the one element everyone else sidestepped. Each person's actions before, during, and after that night begin to make more sense when evaluated through the lens of what that alleged test could confirm or expose. In this context, Tamar's omissions feel intentional. Funky's exit feels instinctive, and Tasha's reveal feels like the missing chapter that completes the puzzle. As the audience reevaluates the timeline, the DNA test becomes the new reference point for truth, shaping public perception more aggressively than any emotional interview or personal testimony could. Ultimately, this single detail recasts the entire sequence of events, demanding transparency and reframing the narrative from a night of confusion to one driven by consequences that may extend far beyond what was originally shared. Funky Dineva's description of the Uber ride introduces an entirely different layer to the narrative, one that Tamar's interview never touched, yet one that fundamentally alters how the public interprets the night. According to Funky, the confined space, the forced proximity, and the sudden drop in energy created a tension that was impossible to ignore. Unlike Tamar's emotionally driven recap, which focused heavily on her internal state and the confusion she claimed to feel, Funky's account centers on observable physical cues: who leaned where, who went silent, who avoided eye contact, and how the mood shifted without a single word being spoken. These subtle but telling dynamics reveal more about the interpersonal truth of that night than Tamar's selective storytelling. Funky made it clear that the closeness did not feel accidental. It felt heavy, loaded, and awkward. He described the silence as the type that fills a room when something unspoken is happening. Something that one person refuses to acknowledge while the other senses it intuitively. Body language became the real dialogue of that ride. The stillness, the stiff shoulders, the leaning, the lack of verbal engagement, and the shifting energy that made Funky uncomfortable enough to remove himself from the situation entirely. This is crucial because Tamar never mentioned any of these dynamics. Her interview avoided describing the physical arrangement, the tension, or the unspoken signals that Funky emphasized. By not addressing these details, she left out contextual elements that would have helped the public understand why Funky reacted the way he did. Tamar's version paints the night as emotionally confusing. Funky's version paints it as physically revealing. His account suggests that something was happening between Tamar and the other party, something she either minimized or omitted in an effort to maintain control of the narrative. The Uber ride becomes a microcosm of the entire controversy. Tamar withholding, Funky witnessing, and the true energy of the night slipping through the cracks. These discrepancies between emotional storytelling and embodied experience create a new tension for audiences to analyze. Funky's recollection forces the question of why Tamar avoided describing the physical environment that night, especially when those subtle moments of closeness are what exposed the underlying dynamic that eventually erupted into public scrutiny. In short, the Uber ride functions as the hidden chapter Tamar never read aloud. But Funky could not ignore one of the most striking elements in Tamar's entire interview is the complete erasure of Mendeecees, the individual who was physically closest to her on the night in question and central to the shift in tension that later unfolded. His absence is not an accidental oversight. It reads as a deliberate structural omission that shapes the way Tamar wants the public to interpret the timeline. When someone is present during a key moment, especially one involving conflict, energy, shifts, or confusion, their role is naturally expected to be mentioned, if only to provide context. Instead, Tamar constructs a narrative where she becomes the sole narrator, the sole victim, and the sole emotional reference point. Mendeecees is removed so thoroughly that the audience is left with no understanding of his behavior, reactions, or involvement. Despite the fact that Funky Dineva's recounting places Mendeecees in a position of direct influence on the dynamics that night, this omission raises questions about what Tamar hoped to prevent the public from connecting. By excluding Mendeecees, she removes any possibility of aligning her story with the physical and emotional cues Funky described. She also avoids the speculation that Mendeecees' behavior, his silence, his energy, his proximity may have been the real trigger for the confusion she claims to have experienced. Tamar's interview presents a world where events happen to her rather than around her, neatly avoiding the messy emotional or relational implications that Mendeecees' presence would force her to confront. Furthermore, the strategic nature of this erasure becomes more obvious when viewed alongside Tasha K's revelation about the alleged DNA test. If Mendeecees has any connection to the test or its surrounding circumstances, Tamar's omission functions as a protective barrier, shielding him from scrutiny and herself from follow-up questions. The public is left to question whether Tamar avoided mentioning Mendeecees because including him would make her emotional narrative harder to maintain, or because it would expose contradictions between her recounting and Funky's. Either way, the calculated absence of someone so central to the night transforms her interview into a curated performance, one designed to control the story rather than transparently recount it. The omission does not reduce suspicion. It amplifies it, prompting viewers to ask why the person closest to her physically is the one she kept farthest from her story. Funky Dineva's decision to exit the situation becomes one of the most consequential turning points in the entire narrative, because everything Tamar later claimed happened fills the exact gap he was not present to witness yet the outcome of. That gap appears to connect directly to the alleged DNA test that later surfaced. Funky's account is firm. The energy in the Uber shifted. The physical closeness felt uncomfortable. And the unspoken tension between Tamar and the man beside her created an atmosphere he could no longer tolerate. So he removed himself. That exit marks the moment the timeline fractures. Up until Funky steps away, the sequence of events is grounded in observable interactions and shared experience. Once he is gone, the story becomes entirely dependent on Tamar's narration. Narration that is emotional, selective, and conspicuously lacking in detail about what happened immediately after he left. This missing segment is crucial because Tamar uses it to frame herself as confused, overwhelmed, and emotionally foggy. Yet the implications that later emerge, especially with Tasha K's mention of the DNA test, suggest something far more consequential than confusion occurred during that time. The fact that Tamar's most emotionally intense claims exist in the unobserved window raises tough questions. Why does everything significant happen when the only third-party witness had already stepped away? Why does Tamar's memory become vague only in this portion of the night, when every other part of her narrative is filled with dramatic detail? And why? Dramatic detail. And why? Does this timeline gap happen to align with the very period that would have led to the circumstances prompting a DNA test? Funky's exit, therefore, exposes a structural weakness in Tamar's version. Once he is gone, her account becomes both unverifiable and strategically constructed. His departure also reinforces why the audience views the later revelations with suspicion. If the critical events occurred after he left, Tamar becomes the sole custodian of information. Yet her retelling avoids the people, behaviors, and context needed to make sense of what unfolded. In contrast, the outcome's public tension, shifting narratives, and the alleged tests suggest actions and interactions took place that her interview does not acknowledge. Funky's instinct to step away thus becomes symbolically significant. He removed himself from an environment that clearly spiraled into complications, omissions, and consequences that only surfaced later. His exit does not simply create a blank space in the story. It unlocks the very questions Tamar's interview conspicuously avoids. The unfolding story is defined as much by what is left unsaid as by what is revealed, highlighting the stark contrast between Tamar's protective storytelling and Funky Dineva's fatigued honesty. Tamar's narrative operates as a shield, carefully constructed to safeguard herself and, implicitly, the individual she erased from her recounting. Every pause, every omission, every blurred emotional description functions as a layer of protection, allowing her to convey vulnerability while maintaining control over sensitive details. She speaks of fear, confusion, and emotional pain, but strategically avoids mentioning proximity, physical closeness, or the person whose presence shifted the night's energy. Her selective retelling ensures that while the audience perceives trauma, they do not gain access to the relational architecture that shaped the events. In contrast, Funky's account is stripped of embellishment, drained of performative emotion, and grounded purely in observation and fact. His voice carries exhaustion, a fatigue born not from disinterest but from years of being misunderstood, misrepresented, and drawn unwillingly into a narrative that was never his to own. Where Tamar's storytelling creates a carefully curated emotional arc, Funky's recounting presents a linear, spatial, and temporally precise version of events, highlighting who was where, when, and how the energy shifted. The contrast between these approaches exposes the differing stakes each had. Tamar risked exposing a connection she wanted to protect, and any deviation could alter public perception of herself or the person she omitted. Funky, on the other hand, risked nothing in terms of personal relationships but carried the burden of truth. Weighed down by years of public assumption and speculation, their narratives are not contradictory but complementary. One intentionally shapes perception through omission. The other insists on clarity despite personal discomfort. The tension between these two modes, protection versus truth, is amplified by the introduction of the DNA test, which acts as an objective anchor between Tamar's emotional fog and Funky's observable reality, where Tamar's omissions attempt to manage consequence and narrative framing. Funky's transparency illuminates the unspoken dynamics, forcing viewers to reconcile the protective storytelling with the facts he provides. In essence, the story is no longer just about what happened, but why each participant chose to present it as they did, showing that narrative is often less about memory and more about the stakes behind disclosure, and that understanding the interplay between protection and truth is essential to uncovering the full scope of that night. The alleged DNA test emerges as the decisive element, forcing the public to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about that night, reframing past interviews, social media speculation, and the emotional performances that previously dominated the conversation. With the test now in play, Tamar's selective omissions, Funky Dineva's observational details, and Tasha K's strategic reveal intersect, creating a clearer framework in which the fragmented timeline can finally be examined. The DNA test does more than confirm or complicate speculation. It aligns with the timeline Funky described, substantiating the presence of someone Tamar intentionally erased from her account and revealing that her narrative was not a record of confusion, but a deliberate protection of a relationship or a dynamic she did not want the public to question. This alignment forces viewers to reconsider the gaps in Tamar's interview, the skipped hours, the unmentioned proximity, and the emotional fog she presented as authentic confusion, and juxtapose them against Funky's precise spatial and environmental observations. Suddenly, what was once perceived as a night full of chaotic, uncontrolled events now appears structured, intentional, and heavily curated. The public is left grappling with the central, unavoidable question: if Tamar was truly alone in her experience, why does the DNA test implicate someone she chose not to name? This question reframes the discussion from conjecture about emotional states to the undeniable presence of a person whose significance was actively minimized. Every pause, every carefully worded explanation, and every protective emotional beat in Tamar's interview now reads differently under the weight of this revelation. Viewers begin replaying moments with fresh eyes, noting how selective memory omitted details, and strategic silences all point toward shielding someone rather than obscuring the truth entirely. The convergence of these narratives underscores a critical point. The story was never about misinformation or misinterpretation alone. It was about choices, control, and protection, and the DNA test exposes a layer of that architecture that cannot be ignored. Ultimately, the revelation compels the audience to reconcile Tamar's protective storytelling with Funky's exhausted honesty, and it leaves an unshakable question at the center of the discussion: who did she erase? And why does the test suggest that this person's presence was as significant as the emotional fallout she shared? This unresolved question now dominates public discourse, driving the conversation beyond speculation and emotion into the realm of accountability and alignment, ensuring that the narrative continues to evolve as viewers seek to understand the truth hidden between the lines.